Mennonite Church, just up the road a ways, a piece. I live in.
Thank you all for being here today and for inviting me to speak. My presentation will take about 20 minutes, and Mark also has some stories that he wants to share with you. We'll have time at the end for questions, and possibly Mark can do a cemetery tour with you if that's something that you're interested in. As you all know, my name is Darlene Schneck, and you may not know that I am a Swiss and German Mennonite on my mother's side of the family. My mother was born Jean Geisinger in 1931 on a farm just down the road from Upper Milford Mennonite Church. My grandparents are in the foreground. That's Della and Clarence Geisinger. And then on the left is my Aunt Grace, my Uncle Russell, who was the organist at Upper Milford Mennonite Church for 50 years. And then next to him is my Uncle Lloyd, who passed away this year. So many of you remember him. You also remember Russell. And some of you may even remember my mother, Jean, on the right. She was a member of Upper Milford until 1953, when she married my father and moved to Schnecksville, where I grew up. That's me on a tractor in Zionsville. I don't drive tractors anymore, but I was sort of enjoying it at the time. I spent a lot of time as a child in Zionsville, and I visited Upper Milford Church many times in the 1960s and 1970s. My mother and I and our ancestors, we come from the Heaston and Gaiman families, who were founding members of Upper Milford Mennonite Church. Our ancestor, John Gaiman, who was born in 1771, was a pastor here for 35 years. Our ancestor, Philip Geisinger, moved to Zionsville from nearby Saucon in 1805, and he married Veronica Heaston, and their former farm lies just beyond the old cemetery of this church. Geisingers have been members of Upper Milford Mennonite Church for 217 years, spanning 7 generations. That's a long time. I want to start off with the Mennonite migration to Pennsylvania. William Penn offered the promise of religious freedom to Christians who were marginalized and persecuted in Europe. These included Quakers, German Baptists, Moravians, Schwenkfelders, Amish, and Mennonites. The Mennonites who came to Pennsylvania came here with a heart of gratitude to God that this would finally be a place where they could live out their faith, free from physical, emotional, and financial threats. The first Mennonite immigrants sailed to Philadelphia in 1683 and established Germantown in what is now Northwest Philadelphia. And this became the base from which newly arriving Mennonites planned their next move into the frontier. It's estimated that 3,000 German-speaking Mennonites immigrated to Pennsylvania between 1683 and 1775. They started moving westward and northward out of Philadelphia as land opened up. The first Mennonites reached the Quakertown area in 1717. Among them was the Mennonite bishop, Valentine Clemmer. Quakertown was then called the Grooten Swamp, or Great Swamp, and that area is still very wet and swampy. As more Mennonites headed north, by the early 1730s, there were Mennonite farms scattered throughout what is now Upper Milford and Upper Saucon townships and the Quakertown area. They first worshiped in homes, and later they built log meeting houses. The three meeting houses in this area were at Swamp, Saucon, and Upper Milford. They were located in a triangle between 5 to 8 miles from each other. The meeting houses had 2 rooms, one for worship and one for a school. The Swamp Meeting House was built in 1735. That building is no longer standing. It was a log building. It once stood near this marker between present-day East Swamp and West Swamp Mennonite Church, northwest of Quakertown. Around 1738, the Saucon Meeting House was built at what is now Coopersburg. That log building stood near the spot where this current building stands. Around this same time, around 1738, the Upper Milford Meeting House was built. The log building was across the street from where you're sitting right now, along Kings Highway. Both the first and second meeting houses are believed to have been at the spot where the arrow is pointing to. All 3 of these Mennonite congregations belonged at that time to the Franconia Conference, which is the oldest Mennonite body in the United States. I want to share a little bit of what it was like in the Zionsville area when the Mennonites first arrived here in the early 1730s. First off, it's amazing to think that the Moravians hadn't arrived yet in Bethlehem. They came in 1741. There was no Allentown. There was no Easton. This was wilderness. Kings Highway, which runs by Upper Milford Church today, was just a native trail. There were a few small homesteads in the area because there were Lutheran and Reformed settlers that had reached this area too. The local native people were from the Lenni Lenape tribe. Their permanent camps were north of the Blue Mountain, but they traveled through this area to hunt. In nearby Veracruz, before the Europeans arrived, the natives did jasper mining, and jasper was used for weapons and tools and trading. There was at one time 100 mine pits at Veracruz, and jasper from those mines could be found all along the East Coast. That's how valuable it was for trading. In Saucon, it's documented that the natives would sometimes stop at the Mennonite meeting house, lay their weapons on the ground, and go inside and sit there quietly while the service was going on. Some were known to be able to speak a few sentences of Pennsylvania Dutch. They would trade with Mennonites, and they liked to roast corn in the Mennonites' lime kilns. Mennonites in this area had good relations with the natives. There were no killings in this area during the French and Indian War. By 1760, there were Mennonites living as far north as the present-day borough of Northampton, known then as Siegfried's. And you can see Northampton is north of Allentown. There were actually some Mennonites that even settled in Bangor in northeast Northampton County, but not much is known about them. So neither the Northampton nor the Bangor settlements have any churches that still exist today. Upper Milford, Saucon, and Swamp are at the northern end of Mennonite settlement in eastern Pennsylvania, and these 3 congregations continue through today. It's interesting to note that Upper Milford Church has been in 3 different counties, all without moving. This is due to the partitioning of counties over the centuries. The spot that you are gathered in today was originally part of Bucks County. And then starting in 1752, it was part of Northampton County. And finally in 1812, part of Lehigh County. Getting back to the 1730s, I like to picture the Mennonites gathered in their log meeting houses, singing in German from their Ostbund hymn books with no musical instruments, just the singing of men and women and children rising out of the Pennsylvania wilderness with nothing but the wind and the birds and the forest animals to accompany them. It's such a beautiful picture. This is a 1759 township map for Northampton County, which then included Lehigh County. The arrow is pointing to King's Highway, which runs by Upper Milford Church. It was surveyed in 1735, and it ran from the tavern in Trexlertown. You can see there's a just to the left of the arrow is the word Trexler and a little house. That's actually still a restaurant today. It ran from that tavern all the way down to Philadelphia. And the east-west road that meets up at the tavern there is now Route 222 today. So you can see that actually King's Highway and Route 222 back in 1759 were kind of like the main highways of that era. King's Highway was one of 9 colonial roads that ran north of Philadelphia, and it was the first north-south road in what is now Lehigh County. This was a busy road in colonial days. Produce from this area was taken by horse and wagon down this highway for 200 years. My own Mennonite grandfather, Clarence Geisinger, who lived here in Zionsville, was selling produce in the 1960s that was being taken down this road to Philadelphia. This Upper Milford area is rich in history, and its earliest years were quite active. The development that has kind of spoiled much of the rest of Lehigh County has fortunately bypassed Upper Milford Township, and we can all be grateful for that. I want to share now a story that happened to my ancestor during the Revolutionary War. Philip Geisinger, who was buried in the old cemetery at Upper Milford, was 4 years old in 1778. 4 years old, and he witnessed something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. The Mennonites who immigrated to Pennsylvania were firmly opposed to the taking of a life and fighting in wars. They took seriously the words of Jesus not to swear an oath. There was great resentment among the Lutheran and Reformed people of Northampton County towards the pacifist groups who wouldn't fight in the Revolutionary War, even though they paid fines for not doing so, and they helped haul supplies for the army when asked. They were also jealous of the Mennonites' wealth. Because the Mennonites had arrived earlier than many of the other settlers, they had a head start, and they had larger farms, and they had more abundance. They were a prime target for abuse. In June of 1778, the power-hungry lieutenant of Northampton County, John Wetzel, along with 2 corrupt judges, twisted a loyalty law that had been recently passed by the General Assembly in Philadelphia. They used this loyalty law to go after the peace groups throughout Northampton County. They went after Moravians, Schwenkfelders, and Mennonites, but they had their greatest success in stripping away wealth from 11 Mennonite families from Saucon. The county authorities took 11 Saucon Mennonite men to Easton, where they were asked to take the loyalty oath. When they refused, they were jailed. Their possessions were inventoried down to the last spoon. In August and September of 1778, auctions were held that drew 2,000 people. Their livestock, their horses, their farming implements, their Bibles, their beds, and everything inside the house was sold at auction. Even their 5-plate stoves were ripped out of the masonry hearth and sold. After the auction was over, 4-year-old Philip Geisinger laid down on the floor with his mother, who was pregnant, and went to sleep. It was a dark and terrible time for these families, and yet God was with them through it all. These are the inventory lists for the 3 Geisinger brothers who were among the 11 families affected. It's the inventories for Henry Geisinger, John Geisinger, and Abraham Geisinger. And this is a partial list for my ancestor, Abraham Geisinger, who was Philip's father. It goes on for 3 more sheets. And this is the house that Abraham Geisinger built 40 years after his possessions were auctioned. God triumphed through adversity. This house is located on Blue Church Road in Coopersburg, just a stone's throw from Pastor Jenny's house. When he was 27 years old, Philip Geisinger moved to Zionsville and married Veronica Heastand. As I mentioned before, their former farm lies just beyond the old cemetery. Here's a photo of Philip and Veronica's graves, and that's my mother, Jean Geisinger Schneck. She is touching Philip's grave at the left, and Veronica is on the right. Mark has a story that he wants to share from the Revolutionary War era. So I turn it over to Mark now.
And I just love the way the guy expressed it. This book is by Andrew Berkey, so I just left it alone. I will read the account. But before I start the story, Darlene had alluded to something. It was a confusing time to live in Pennsylvania between the French and Indian War and the Revolution. So to give you a little bit of background, during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, the pacifist Christians, Mennonites included among them, did not want to fight in or support the war in any way. Because of this, some of their high church neighbors became fearful or resentful that the pacifists would not participate in protecting their communities. While this is going on, at the same time, you have the Quaker-leaning Pennsylvania government was concerned that these immigrants from the Palatinate were not assimilating. They were clustering in their own little groups. They were maintaining their own dialects and folk ways. They just kind of weren't intermixing. So there was concern about that too. So that was going on. So you have misunderstanding and distrust is growing. So as you move forward 13 years from the French and Indian War to the Revolution, this is the misunderstandings and suspicions came into play again. They were building again as the rebellion and then the revolution got started. So this is the story of Henry Funk. On August 6th, 1777, Miller Henry Funk saddled his horse and went up through the valley to make several business calls. This is Hose and Sack. It's just a few miles down the road here. He felt obligated to pay a farmer for some wheat he had purchased in July, and then he also wanted to visit blacksmith Nicholas Klotz and inquire about progress on a new freight wagon he had ordered for the mill. Funk's horseback ride took him past the Buckhorn Tavern, which still stands on the King's Highway. It's an establishment he generally shunned because he was a pious man and a spiritual leader in the Mennonite Church. Funk made his business calls, but he never got past the tavern on his return ride. As he approached the inn, two loiterers jumped from the doorway, halted his horse, and forced him to accompany them to Frederick Limbach, a justice of the peace, whose office was located several miles down the King's Highway. Henry Funk, because of his religious convictions, had not taken an oath of allegiance to the Continental Congress. And during the critical hours of the Revolution, such an omission was tantamount to treason. The two loiterers swore before the justice that they were convinced Henry Funk was a spy. The reason for their suspicions? Because he travels forwards and backwards past the tavern, and for refusing to take the oath. 3 days later, Miller Henry Funk was committed to county jail at Easton. Fortunately, Henry Funk had company in the Easton jail. A Schwenkfelder spiritual leader, George Kriebel, had been arrested under similar circumstances by Justice Limbach the week before Funk made his melancholy trip. Kriebel had some influential friends in political circles, and before a month had passed, Justice Limbach was sharply reprimanded for his overzealous acts, and Funk and Kriebel were released from their confinement. Funk returned to his mill and went quietly to work, turning out barrels of flour for the Continental Army, doing a great deal of business for the public in the purchasing and milling way. As a result of his bitter brush with the law, Funk took the required oath of allegiance. But this action only served to alienate some of the pacifistic members of his congregation, and they read him out of the Mennonite Society. To make matters worse for the harassed Miller, Justice Limbach, incensed by the official rebuke, attempted to revenge himself on Funk by imposing fines in lieu of actual malicious service. The bewildered Miller, Henry Funk, finding it impossible to serve his country and his conscience at the same time, sold the mill to his former jail companion, George Kriebel, and removed his family to the more safe and receptive climate of North Carolina. So it just gives you an idea of how confusing and difficult a time it was to live. That's what I have for that one.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to turn now to the 19th century. In 1816, the Upper Milford congregation decided to replace their log meeting house with a stone meeting house. And here is a drawing of that meeting house. These are the early pastors at Upper Milford. There are no images of the first four pastors. Reverend Joseph Shantz and Reverend William Gaiman were co-pastors for a time. Shantz was pastor from 1844 to 1881. He led the church through the 1847 creation of the Eastern District Conference, when 16 congregations in Lehigh, Berks, and Bucks County broke away from the Franconia Conference. They were led by the progressive John Oberholzer, who advocated for a written constitution and written conference minutes. These congregations were a quarter of the Franconia Conference. After they broke away, they were commonly referred to as New Mennonites versus the Old Mennonites of the Franconia Conference. These New Mennonites were generally more open to non-Mennonite ideas than the Old Mennonites, but change still happened slowly. My great-grandmother, Rebecca Gaiman, a member of Upper Milford, wore a prayer cap up until the day she married John Geisinger in 1874. 10 years after the Eastern District was created, in 1857, a split occurred at Upper Milford Church. Out of this split came the present-day Bible Fellowship Church. In the mid-1800s, Pietist revivalism often led by Methodists, was sweeping the country. These revival meetings and prayer meetings came to Zionsville, and Reverend Shantz and Reverend Gaiman, along with the congregation, were split on whether this evangelistic activity was a good thing. William Gaiman was raised in a Lutheran home, and as a young man, he was converted at a prayer meeting. He joined the New Mennonites at Upper Milford and was a co-pastor there from 1849 to 1857. He and his followers saw this evangelism as a struggle between dead orthodoxy and living Christianity. The other side saw it as emotionalism leading to fanaticism. They spoke of the strange displays of emotion with hand clapping and shouting, and they didn't agree with baptism by immersion. In 1857, Reverend Gaiman and 23 members of Upper Milford Mennonite Church started meeting in a store in nearby Hossensack. In 1859, they built the Evangelical Mennonite Church in Zionsville. Not long after, a second Evangelical Mennonite Church was built in Coopersburg, across the street from the Saucon Mennonite Church. Over time, this denomination grew and went through a series of name changes and is now called the Bible Fellowship Church. As Upper Milford Church moved through the second half of the 19th century, the Eastern District Conference dealt with issues such as foot washing. In other words, was Jesus' command literal or was it spiritual? They dealt with things like membership in secret societies, going to court, dress customs, enlisting in the army, and the formation of Sunday schools. Sunday school began at Upper Milford Mennonite Church in the 1850s. In the 1870s, the congregation at Upper Milford wanted to build a new church on higher ground. They purchased a 1/4 acre from my great-great-grandfather, Abraham Geisinger, who's actually right behind me here. He was Philip Geisinger's son. This new church, in which you are gathered today, was built in 1876 at a cost of $6,700. There was a place for a pipe organ, which was something new for the congregation. And Mark has some comments about the building of the current church.
As Darlene said, this structure was built in 1876. She noted the time of Sunday school starting. The thing that's different about this building than a lot of its contemporary Mennonite structures is the floor where we're sitting is a dedicated Sunday school area. When you think of most meeting houses, they're single story. You might have a meeting room and also a gathering that could be used for school, but this has a whole floor that can be devoted to Sunday school. So this is a little bit different. So that was kind of cutting edge or modern for the time, at least for a rural church. But this again illustrates the struggle. While the building was more modern, there was a gentleman that lived over on a farm the next valley over, by the name of William Moyer. The farm still stands. The farm said it's beautiful. And Mr. Moyer had the idea that he would furnish a bell for the congregation to call people to worship. So he donated the bell. The congregation refused to use it. It was too modern. So although they built the structure, the bell was too modern. So Mr. Moyer took his bell and went home, but he didn't leave the congregation. He had the bell put up on his property, which is just over the hill. And every Sunday that there was worship here, he would ring the bell before he came to church. So it was his solution to staying in community, but doing his own thing at the same time. Thanks, Darlene.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. In 1930, German services were finally discontinued at Upper Milford Mennonite Church. And in 1973, the interior of the church was remodeled. Fast forward to 2019, the Eastern District and the Franconia Conferences joined together to create Mosaic, ending 172 years of separation. Congregations from other nations and cultures have joined Mosaic Conference, bringing fresh perspectives and energy. This has led to a new era in which the church globally and locally is led by women and men of diverse backgrounds. Upper Milford Mennonite Church continues today as a place of worship, prayer, and song, nearly 3 centuries after the first Mennonites arrived by horse and wagon. Glory be to God. And thank you all for letting me share this history. And I welcome now any questions you may have.
First of all. Thank you so much, Darlene and Mark. That was terrific. Yeah.
My uncle, who was part of the congregation, her father were part of a crew who built the basement, which housed the first bathrooms. I remember as a child, there was outhouse right in the back here at the end of the building. So yes, this basement was built with shovels.
Darlene, I was wondering if you could all say a few words about the Dillingersville Schoolhouse.
I'm not up to speed on the Dillingerville Schoolhouse. It's very, very old, and it was a public school. Beyond that, I'm sorry, I don't have that in my brain right now.
You know, up in Old Zionsville, there's a UCC church and a Lutheran church. And back, was it in the 1700s, the 3 churches existed, and they went together to build a schoolhouse up in Dillingersville.
And it's in here.
Which stands today. We have in the last Sunday in June every year, the 3 churches have a pilgrimage, and they all have a joint. We erect a large tent and have a joint worship service up there by the schoolhouse.
Yeah, and it's on page 7 of the history book in here. The interesting thing is that we have a very vibrant, thriving, connected ministerium, and to this day, like we, have a text group. One more church has joined it, the Methodist Church.
Well, we had more. The
right.
EC church had been in, and then something happened last year that they said they no longer could. They're considered the Zionsville ministerium. My understanding is probably because of the divide that the Bible Fellowship was spun off of our church, the Bible Fellowship Church refused to join the ministerium. And I think somebody had said, like, they told somebody if we were in it, they were not going to be. And so it's like that division still exists, which is hard to fathom.
Yes, right. All those fractures are.
Similar to how, like, when Franconia and Eastern District were merging to Mosaic, they were concerned about some of the congregations that had, people had left the Franconia congregation to go to the Eastern District congregation across the street in some of the cases, and, some of how people's feelings were hurt and whatnot. And it's similar to how people had those concerns. I mean, it's the kind of thing, no one's trying to merge us with the Bible Fellowship, but that it sounds like they don't even want to be in any kind of association with us.
But to this day, we, as Susan said, we care for and steward the Dillingersville Schoolhouse together. We sit on a board that does that. We run a food pantry together that happens at the Lutheran Church. We do shared services. We just did a Thanksgiving service together. So we do legend services together. We do pulpit exchanges occasionally. And we help, we always have emails and text groups going with, a woman showed up, can we use some of the ministerial money to help her pay her rent this month? And like that just happened.
So you actually have a shared money fund.
Yes.
That's a pretty serious ministerium. That's not just.
That's a small fund, though.
Yes, but it's very small.
That's only, I think, used for those kinds of.
Yeah,
I know, but
it's something though.
Yeah, it's different than a lot of ministeriums.
Yeah, we actually we share money, we work together. talk to each other, help each other.
The joint parents has been in operation over 10 years.
And so that's kind of probably part of the, keeps the relationship going.
Yes.
It says in here that you have a parsonage. Do you still have that? Do you use
No.
it?
No, we sold that off, what, 5 years ago, maybe? That's at the first building down was our parsonage, and we had made the decision that, we had the last Pastor B's that had, retired around 2000 or so. And then we were renting it for a while because the pastors that we got, and after that, were part-time, and I think that was when Dave was first hired. I don't think his position was necessarily deemed part-time, but kind of with the structuring and everything, and we did deem it a part-time position. So it kind of felt that future pastors, to get a part-time pastor would be difficult to find somebody that was going to need the parsonage. So,
And I'm living on Geisinger land now, so now that's my parsonage. Right, Darlene. Yeah, we found that out at Lloyd Geisinger's funeral. Darlene and I were talking, and she asked me, "Where do you live?" And her jaw dropped. And she said, "Oh my goodness!" So that's Phillips. We figured out that was Phillips' land, while it's Abraham's house down the road, right? Is that correct?
That was, there were, in my Geisinger line, there were 2 Phillips and 2 Abrahams, so it gets a little confusing. The immigrant Philip, who was born in 1701, is buried at Upper Saucon, at the Saucon Mennonite Church. He owned over 700 acres in Upper Saucon in the mid 1700s. He was like the 3rd wealthiest private individual. I mean, the Moravian community had a lot of wealth because they owned everything in common. But I mean, as a landowner, he was way up there, and he gave away or sold very cheaply his land to his sons. He had a large family, but he owned basically all the land from where the Blue Church is in Coopersburg all the way over to Mill Road. I mean, I drive around that area sometimes, and I just can't believe you can drive for like a mile or 2 and you're still on, his original land. He bought his first tract from William Allen, who was the founder of Allentown. So William Allen was like a land broker in the area. And so what happened is, these early settlers came and they were able to gobble up quite large tracts of land. And Philip was one of the first European settlers in what is now Lehigh County. So that was Philip. And then it was his 3 sons who were in prison and had their things confiscated. But the immigrant Philip, through my research, because I'm writing a book about this 1778 incident, I learned that because I now know what the immigrant Philip's signature looks like. And I saw a petition that there were originally 12 men in prison, and then only 11 after, then one of them was released, Philip. And I discovered it was actually Philip the immigrant and not his son Philip, who was imprisoned briefly. So you had the immigrant Philip, who was a great wealthy landowner and was actually a colonial judge of elections. He was thrown into jail by these men who were after their wealth. And it's quite a story of the birth of our democracy in this little spot in Lehigh County.
Thank you. Any other questions for Darlene?
Darlene, I have a question. It's not so much with church history, but family history. Did your parents publish and write a book on family life on the farm just down the road here?
Yes, that was my book. It was called The Last Generation on the Farm, and that's the story of Clarence and Della Geisinger at the farm just down the road, which I showed you a picture of.
she wrote the book.
I need to say it. That was one of the most interesting and I think focused story of family life on the farm that I've ever read. Excellent.
Oh,
And your mother did the writing of some of that, or maybe you did, but the writing that she did describing the life on the farm, just how a corn picker worked. She described that so accurately and so well. It was a really interesting book. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad that I was, that both my parents are still alive. They're almost 92. I've been able to kind of mine their brains for their memories of this bygone era, which to me is extraordinarily fascinating because they witnessed this transition from horse-drawn equipment to modern farm equipment and tractors. And I mean, it was a huge transformation in the society. And my grandmother happened to take a lot of pictures with her Brownie camera. Her camera is actually right behind me on the shelf here. And I mean, this humble little $2 camera, she took extraordinary pictures of ordinary life on the farm. And when I asked my mother to write her memories, every time my mother wrote a memory, there was a photograph to go with it. I mean, it was like my grandmother was right there writing the book with us. It was extraordinary. I think the funniest one was when my mom wrote a little story about hanging up the wash, and there was a picture of my mom as an 8-year-old hanging up wash on the farm. I mean, I think it was really great because a lot of photography at that time was done by men, but here you had a woman who was looking at a woman's perspective, taking a picture of her children in pajamas, first day of school, and just these wonderfully just normal little activities of daily life on the farm. And that was what was so beautiful about that book. It was 3 generations working together. One generation deceased, but the negatives were passed down and saved. And so I was very glad for that. But thank you for your compliments. I'll pass that along to my mother.
Any other questions for Darlene?
Well, I was going to make a comment about the Yoder family in the Quakertown, Coopersburg area. I went to Coopersburg High School, and we talk about somebody 92. In 5 years, I'll be 92. So I think I'm somewhat qualified to comment, but I have no relatives that were Mennonite. But Wesley Yoder was my best friend in my class. We graduated in 1953, and down the road from where they lived, they had a cider press and an orchard. And one of their neighbors was Coralie, the girl that sat behind me, and I later married. But anyway, they founded the Yoder School, which is, you can still find the building. You can tell it was originally the Yoder School. Now, I learned in Veracruz that there's a Yoder School in this neighborhood. I'm not sure where it is, but maybe there are more Yoders here. Anyway, I asked Wesley about the family history, and he said the family got their land grant directly from William Penn. During that period when William Penn gave German families and European families land in Pennsylvania. And that was where the Quakertown Airport is today. And that was the original Yoder family. The Yoder family that was in Quakertown in Coopersburg. They may not be related to the ones in this area.
But they're related to me.
Are they?
We'll have to talk.
And welcome to the Mennonite Way. That's great.
So
I have another
Darlene,
question, Darlene.
Yes,
Have you read John Ruth's book, This Very Ground, This Crooked Affair?
I have it on order. I'm getting it for Christmas from a friend.
You two should definitely connect.
Darlene,
But I have I have John Ruth's, all of his other books.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's great.
do you want a human interest story about your grandmother?
Yes.
Okay, this also goes with a combination of the Lutheran and Music Church when I was in the youth group. If you can imagine me being a teenager. We didn't do too much together with the other churches, but we decided, or somebody decided, that there was going to be a dance at the Lutheran church. Well, let me explain a couple things first. most of the youth in this church went to Emmaus High School. I went to Southern Lehigh. I was very shy. The last thing in the world I was going to do was to go to a dance where I didn't know a percentage of the people, and I didn't feel sociably apt to do that. That was a Saturday night. Sunday morning, Della came to me, and I can always remember, I think I was right outside that side door. She said, "Did you go to the dance?" And I honestly can say no. She said, "Good girl." You could tell she wasn't ready for dances yet.
Oh, really?
Not ready for the Mennonite girls to be dancing.
That's great.
That was Della.
Well, thank you so much, Darlene, for all the time you took with us. I think we'll go take a look at the sanctuary for a moment, and then I know Mark has some pictures and things over here we can look at. So you won't be able to connect with us as we're doing all that. So we'll disconnect with you. But
Okay.
thank you so much for this morning. It was wonderful.
One more question.
Oh, one more question
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Marky. Sorry.
I like to photo, but I'm not the photographer. But in front of me, I saw the picture so wide. If I use the phone, they call it panorama. It's so wide. So I just curious what kind of lens or what kind of photo they take it, because that is so clear and so wide.
Yeah.
That is amazed me. Somebody took it. That
Darlene,
is-
this is the picture that he's referring
Yeah.
to.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I've never seen one of those cameras, but they were very popular, the turn of the last century. They were cameras that had the ability to take a very, very wide panorama like that. And sometimes you can find a person appearing twice in the photo because it took a while for the camera to pan across the crowd. You had to be really still. And if somebody kind of snuck around from one side and went around the back, you could be in the picture twice.
Wow.
That's great.
So that's a Sunday school would it have just been Upper Milford, or would have that been the joint?
No, I think that's just
I
Upper
think that
Milford.
was just us.
They call it panorama.
Wow, 1926, that's a lot of people.
There's a lot of
I
people.
don't think so.
Yeah.
They would have fit
On that time, on
in this
1926,
building?
they only have one.
Yeah,
I
we'll
don't-
see. Upstairs it would have been pretty big.
Pretty crammed in. Yeah.
The one
Yeah.
that I know of, if
Yeah,
you move
with
the camera,
Yeah,
as
with the-
you're taking a picture, a person can move from one end of the.
yeah, like this one.
Yeah.
They call it panorama.
We're
Yeah.
discussing panoramic shots.
And now iPhones can do the same thing,
Just saying. Yeah.
He was just amazed they could do it in 1926.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is pretty amazing.
It is. I know. I've often wondered. I've often thought that when I looked at that, how did they have that?
And keep everybody still that long.
Yeah.
Yes.
Don't move. It's hard to take a group picture. Oh, Melky's doing a panorama right now.
I had to behave myself over there.
Yeah, he's our resident photographic documenter. Thanks again, Darlene.
Well, thank you all. It was a privilege being here today. I really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Duh.
So should we take a walk upstairs?
Is that your second cousin?